You weren't ignored because you spoke too little. You were ignored because you spoke too much to someone who survives by running from emotion. And here's the truth no one warned you about. The moment you went silent, something inside them finally woke up, not peace, fear. You were taught that love means explaining, clarifying, reaching again when someone pulls away, but no one told you what happens when the person you love is avoidant. They don't hear love the way you do. They hear pressure. They don't feel closeness as safety. They feel it as loss of control. And so you tried harder. You softened your voice. You chose better words. You gave them understanding they never asked for, until one day you stopped, not to punish, not to manipulate, but because your soul was tired of begging to be felt. And that silence was not weakness. It was power. Let me show you why. You don't realize how much power your words were giving away until you stopped using them. When you were explaining yourself to an avoidant, you thought you were building a bridge. You thought clarity would create closeness. You believed that if you could just say it the right way, soften the tone, remove the pressure, they would finally understand what you were trying to give them. But what was really happening was quieter and far more damaging. Every explanation became a shield for them. Every emotional paragraph gave them cover. They didn't have to feel anything deeply because your words did the work for them. You named the feelings. You interpreted the silence. You filled in the emotional gaps they refused to touch. And as long as you kept doing that, they never had to face themselves. An avoidant doesn't fear love the way people think. They fear emotional exposure. They fear being seen without armor. Your constant explaining gave them armor. It allowed them to stay distant while appearing engaged. They could listen, nod, even respond with logic, while never actually opening the door to their inner world. They stayed protected because you kept knocking instead of stepping back. The moment you went silent, that protection collapsed. There was nothing left to hide behind. No long messages to analyze. No emotions delivered neatly for them to avoid. No reassurance that you were still waiting. Silence creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the avoidant can no longer outsource emotional processing to you. They can't lean on your empathy, your patience, your willingness to carry the weight of the connection. They are left alone with the tension they spent their entire life escaping. Your silence doesn't attack them. It doesn't accuse. It simply removes the escape route. And when that happens, something unfamiliar rises. Not clarity, not peace, discomfort. They start to feel something they've trained themselves not to feel. Emotional responsibility. The realization that connection requires participation, not observation. Your silence becomes louder than any message you ever sent because it exposes what was always missing. Not love, presence, effort, emotional risk. You didn't change to punish them. You changed because you stopped doing the work for two people, and the moment you stopped, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. When you kept explaining, the avoidance stayed in control without ever announcing it. Control wasn't loud or aggressive. It was subtle. It lived in the timing of their replies, in how close they let you get before pulling away, in how much vulnerability they allowed before shutting down. Your words kept the system running. As long as you were reaching, clarifying, adjusting, they didn't have to make a choice. They could stay half present and call it balance. They could withdraw without consequence because you were still there, waiting, understanding, holding the emotional thread together. Silence disrupts that entire structure. It removes predictability, and avoidants rely on predictability to feel safe. Not emotional safety, control safety. When you stop explaining, they don't know what to do with the space you leave behind. The familiar pattern breaks. There's no signal to respond to, no emotional cue to manage, no opportunity to reset the distance on their terms. Suddenly, they're not the one deciding when connection happens. They're reacting instead of directing. That loss of control doesn't feel dramatic at first. It feels confusing. They check the earphone more often. They replay the last interaction. They wonder if they misread something. And that uncertainty unsettles them because uncertainty means they're no longer in charge of the emotional pace. Silence shifts the balance without confrontation. You didn't demand anything. You didn't threaten. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that required you to give more than you received. Control thrives on engagement. Silence starves it. And in that starvation, the avoidant has to face a question they've avoided their entire life. What happens if I don't pull away first? When you stop chasing clarity, the illusion that they were choosing distance disappears. Now distance is happening without their permission, and that's when the internal panic begins. not because they lost you yet, but because they might not be able to control the outcome. Avoidants don't reflect while they're being spoken to. They reflect in the quiet after. While you were explaining, they were managing, filtering, minimizing, waiting for the emotional wave to pass. Words gave them something to push against. Silence gives them nothing. And that nothing becomes unbearable over time. Without your voice filling the space, their own thoughts get louder. Memories surface. Moments they dismissed replay with new weight, not because they suddenly became emotionally fluent, but because there's no longer an external distraction. Silence forces internal dialogue. And for someone who avoids introspection, that's deeply unsettling. They start revisiting moments they thought were resolved. The way you looked tired but still tried. The pauses you left for them to step in emotionally and they didn't. The consistency you offered without guarantees. Your silence reframes those memories. It strips away the narrative that you were too much or asking for too much. Now the only thing echoing is absence. And absence makes people question their assumptions. They begin asking themselves questions they never asked while you were present. Why did it feel easier to withdraw than to stay? Why did intimacy feel like pressure instead of connection? Why does silence feel heavier than all those conversations combined? These questions don't arrive gently. They arrive late at night, in moments of stillness, in between distractions. Silence gives those thoughts room to breathe. You didn't force reflection, you made it unavoidable. And that's why silence is so powerful with an avoidant. It doesn't chase insight, it waits for it. And when insight finally comes, it doesn't come wrapped in defensiveness. It comes raw, unprotected, without your emotional labor softening the impact. Avoidants don't fear loss the way others do until loss becomes real. While you were explaining, reassuring, staying emotionally available, they could believe you would always return. That belief kept fear dormant. Silence changes that equation, not suddenly, gradually. The first stage isn't panic, it's dismissal. They tell themselves you're just taking space, that you'll reach out soon, that nothing has changed. But silence has a way of stretching time. And as time stretches, certainty erodes. Fear doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in through cracks. A song, a memory, a moment when they reach for connection out of habit and realize it's no longer guaranteed. They begin to fade. Something unfamiliar, consequence, not punishment, consequence. The realization that emotional distance doesn't freeze relationships, it risks them. Silence turns theoretical loss into something tangible, something that can actually happen. For someone avoidant, fear of loss isn't about missing companionship. It's about losing control of the narrative they've lived by, the belief that closeness is optional, that people stay even when they give very little. Silence challenges that belief without argument. It lets reality speak, and reality doesn't negotiate. They start wondering if you're moving on, if someone else will meet the emotional needs they avoided, if the version of you they took for granted is slipping beyond reach. That fear isn't always expressed outwardly. Often it stays internal, but it changes how they see the situation. Silence turns emotional safety into emotional risk, and risk is the one thing avoidance can't ignore forever. You gave away power slowly without noticing. Every time you explained your feelings instead of honoring them. Every time you adjusted your needs to make the relationship easier. Power didn't disappear in one moment. It eroded through overgiving. Silence is not about reclaiming dominance. It's about reclaiming self-respect. When you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop asking someone to understand what they consistently refuse to engage with. Silence recenters you. It pulls your attention back from their reactio. NS. To your own internal state. You begin noticing how exhausted you were, how much emotional energy you invested just to maintain basic connection. Silence gives you back the space you were using to manage their comfort. And in that space, something shifts. You stand differently. You speak differently. When you choose to speak at all, this shift is subtle but powerful. Avoidants feel it immediately, even if they can't name it. The energy changes. There's no longer an emotional invitation they can accept or reject at will. You're not chasing clarity. You're not waiting for permission to exist fully, and that grounded presence changes how you're perceived. Not because you became distant, but because you became whole again. Silence isn't withdrawal, it's alignment, and alignment is magnetic. It communicates boundaries without ultimatums, strength without aggression, self-worth without explanation. That's the kind of power that doesn't beg to be acknowledged, it simply exists. Silence doesn't guarantee reconciliation, it guarantees truth. When you stop filling the gaps, reality fills them instead. If someone cares, they move toward you. If they're capable of growth, they show effort. If they were only comfortable, While you carried the emotional weight, they disappear. Silence removes ambiguity. It strips away hope based on potential and replaces it with evidence. This is the hardest part, because silence doesn't just reveal them. It reveals the relationship for what it always was. And what you imagined it could become. You no longer have to interpret mixed signals. You no longer have to translate distance into hidden depth. Silence turns patterns into answers. And those answers are painful, but clean. They don't drag on. They don't confuse. They don't keep you suspended in emotional limbo. Silence gives you back clarity without confrontation, without drama, without self-betrayal. You don't need to announce boundaries when your actions already speak. Silence becomes the language of truth, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to see clearly. And once you see clearly, you're no longer trapped in cycles of explanation. You're free to choose what happens next. You were never too much. You were simply giving your heart to someone who had not yet learned how to stay present with their own. And silence did not erase the love you felt. It revealed where that love was being carried alone. When you stopped explaining, you didn't abandon the connection. You stopped abandoning yourself. That moment was not weakness. It was the first act of emotional honesty in a dynamic built on avoidance. Silence did what words never could. It removed illusion. It exposed imbalance. It showed you that love cannot be sustained by effort from one side while the other survives by distance. And while silence may have awakened something inside them, its true purpose was always you. To return you to your center, to remind you that connection should not cost your peace. That love should require you to disappear emotionally just to keep someone comfortable. You learn that clarity doesn't come from convincing someone to understand you. It comes from watching how they show up when you stop carrying the weight. Silence allowed truth to rise without force. It showed you whether there was growth or simply familiarity, whether there was care or just convenience. And that truth, however painful, freed you from guessing, hoping, and waiting. What you do with that freedom is yours to decide. You may walk away with strength, you may stand still with dignity, or you may move forward with eyes open and boundaries intact, but you will never again mistake emotional absence for mystery or distance for depth. Silence taught you the language of self-respect, and once you learn it, you never forget how to speak it. Silence doesn't just change how the avoidant feels about you, it rewires how they relate to emotional intimacy itself. When you were present and explaining, intimacy stayed abstract for them. It lived in theory, not in the body. They could talk about closeness without actually sitting inside it. Silence changes that because intimacy is no longer something they can manage intellectually. It becomes something they must feel physically. The absence of your voice removes their ability to keep emotion at arm's length. Suddenly, intimacy is no longer optional. It's either faced or avoided completely, and that moment forces a deeper reckoning than any conversation ever could. Avoidants are often comfortable with the idea of love, but uncomfortable with the experience of it. Silence turns love from a concept into a sensation. They feel it in their chest as tension, in their thoughts as restlessness, in their nervous system as unease. This is because silence removes the buffer they relied on, your emotional presence doing the regulating for both of you. When you stop soothing, reassuring, and emotionally initiating, they lose the stabilizer that allowed them to engage without vulnerability. And in that destabilization, their relationship with intimacy is exposed. For the first time, closeness feels risky not because you're demanding it, but because they might actually lose it. Silence forces them to confront the truth that intimacy requires action, not just tolerance. It requires responsiveness, not just availability. And many avoidants have never had to face that demand directly. They've survived by keeping intimacy on a delay. Silence collapses that delay. It asks a quiet but terrifying question. If I don't move toward connection now, will it disappear? That question lingers longer than any argument ever could. Silence also dismantles the emotional narrative the avoidant built to protect themselves. While you were explaining, they could tell themselves a familiar story, that you were emotional, that you wanted too much. That distance was necessary to keep things balanced. That story allowed them to stay emotionally comfortable while still feeling justified. Silence disrupts that story without confrontation. When you stop reaching out, their internal explanations begin to fall apart. There's no emotional behavior to blame, no reaction to interpret as pressure, no evidence that you're asking for more than they can give. This is where silence becomes psychologically destabilizing. The avoidant is forced to rewrite the narrative they've relied on. If you're not chasing, not explaining, not reacting, then maybe the problem wasn't your emotions. Maybe the distance wasn't a response to pressure. Maybe it was a habit. Maybe it was fear. Silence doesn't accuse them of this. It lets the realization grow organically, and organic realizations are harder to escape. They may resist this internally at first, minimize it, distract themselves. But over time, the absence of emotional noise makes their old story feel thin, incomplete, unconvincing. Silence removes the external justification for emotional withdrawal, leaving only the internal reason. And that's uncomfortable, because internal reasons can't be blamed on someone else. Silence pushes accountability inward without ever demanding it. And accountability, once felt, cannot be unheard. Finally, silence creates emotional contrast, and contrast is what makes realizations stick. When you were always present, always explaining, always available, your emotional energy blended into the background. It became expected, familiar, invisible. Silence creates a before and after. The nervous system notices contrast more than consistency. The avoidant begins to feel the difference between emotional presence and emotional absence, not intellectually, but experientially. They remember how it felt when you were there. Not just your words, but your warmth, your attunement, your steadiness. This contrast awakens delayed emotion. Avoidants often don't miss people in the moment. They miss them in retrospect. Silence gives space for that retrospection to occur. Without you actively engaging, memories surface unprompted, not just memories of conflict, but moments of calm, safety, and genuine connection. Silence allows those moments to breathe, to be felt, to be longed for, and longing is something avoidants rarely allow themselves to experience consciously. Contrast also removes emotional entitlement. When your presence is no longer guaranteed, it becomes valuable again, not because you withdrew to manipulate, but because you stopped offering yourself unconditionally in an imbalanced dynamic. Silence teaches through absence. It shows what was being given freely and what is now missing. And that realization, when it comes, is deeply embodied. It doesn't rely on persuasion. It doesn't need explanation. It is felt as loss, awareness, and sometimes regret. And if they never return, know this. You did not lose something rare. You released something incomplete. You chose peace over confusion, presence over potential. And that choice will echo forward into every connection you build from here on, because you now know what it feels like to come home to yourself. If this message spoke to something you've been carrying quietly, know that you are not alone in it. Your awareness is your power, and your healing has already begun. If this resonated with you, support the channel by liking the video and sharing it with someone who needs these words today. Subscribe for more deep psychological insights on love, attachment, and emotional strength. Until next time, protect your peace, honor your truth, and remember, sometimes the strongest voice is the one that chooses silence.